Under the fading light of a late spring afternoon, Anna King stood at the edge of her newly acquired backyard, silently tracing the worn outline of a rusted industrial wall that loomed behind her property like a relic of a forgotten time. The bricks were cracked and mottled with age, covered in faded graffiti, broken vents, and patches of old concrete that flaked off with every strong gust of wind. It was the kind of wall that no one would describe as beautiful, yet it held a strange permanence in the otherwise quiet residential neighborhood. When Anna had first toured the house, it was this very wall that nearly made her turn down the sale. But the house itself, solid, spacious, and tucked away at the corner of a rarely traveled road, felt like the right place to start over. After losing her husband 3 years earlier, Anna had spent too much time drifting in rented apartments that never felt like home. Here, at least, there was something permanent. In the weeks following her move, Anna made the house her own. She refinished cabinets by hand, painted every wall herself, and spent hours in the backyard pulling weeds and planting perennials. But no matter how much care she poured into the space, that looming brick wall always hung over her shoulder, a reminder that beauty had its limits. The wall wasn't just ugly. It was an eyesore, collecting wind-blown trash from nearby lots and attracting stray cats that clawed at the rotting base. It blocked the late afternoon sun and cast long, uneven shadows across the garden. So she made a decision. She would build a fence. Not to shut the world out, but to reclaim her view. She hired a local contractor who came highly recommended and knew the zoning regulations inside out. They followed every rule, kept the height legal, didn't overstep any boundaries, used treated wood for longevity. Within 4 days, a handsome 8-foot cedar fence wrapped around the yard, clean and level, cutting off the wall from view and transforming the space into something finally resembling peace. It wasn't about hiding from the past, it was about claiming the present. And for the first time in years, Anna stood in her yard without that heavy presence at her back, finally able to watch the sky without a rotting wall staring back. It was the morning after the fence was finished when the letter came. Folded precisely and taped to her mailbox, it bore no postage, no name. Just a single printed page in bold black ink that read like a threat dressed in legalese. Her fence, it claimed, had significantly altered the visual balance of the historic vista, and negatively impacted the continuity of neighborhood aesthetics, citing obscure civic language she'd never heard of. Anna read the letter twice, slowly, trying to understand if it was a joke. But it wasn't. At the bottom, in cramped cursive penmanship, was a signature. Mark Sloan. She didn't know him, not personally. She'd seen him once, perhaps, an older man with a rigid posture and a clipped gait, walking a small dog with a limp leash and a scowl etched into his face like a permanent mask. He lived behind her, somewhere on the other side of the wall. She hadn't even realized his windows could possibly face hers. What vista could he be clinging to when the only thing between them was a crumbling factory wall no one had maintained in decades? The letter didn't explain what exactly Sloan wanted, just that the matter was pending further review, and would be escalated to formal channels if not addressed. Anna stood in her kitchen, the letter still in her hand, her coffee growing cold. She wasn't angry yet, just confused. It hadn't occurred to her that a neighbor would take issue with something so basic, so reasonable. She didn't build a tower. She didn't violate anyone's privacy. She built a simple, solid fence that followed every line of the law. Still, there was something in the tone of that letter, something practiced and intentionally vague, that sent a small chill crawling down her spine. She'd lived through grief. She'd rebuilt her life once already. She wasn't about to let someone tear it down over a stretch of wood and a brick wall no one else had ever cared about. It wasn't more than 5 days after that letter appeared that Anna found a man in a pressed blazer standing at her front gate. No badge, no appointment, just standing there like he belonged, his hand resting on the latch as though he had the right to let himself in. She noticed him from the kitchen window as she wiped down the counters. At first, she thought maybe it was another contractor, someone inquiring about work. But when she stepped outside, he didn't greet her with the usual relaxed courtesy she'd come to expect from tradesmen. Instead, he held up a yellow envelope like it was something sacred, something that gave him authority over her entire existence. "Mrs. King," he began, his voice low, his tone practiced. "This is to notify you that formal legal proceedings have been initiated regarding the obstruction you've erected along the northern boundary of your property." The word obstruction hit her like a slap. She blinked, not entirely sure she'd heard him correctly. Before she could ask what he meant, he continued, his words pouring out like they'd been rehearsed a dozen times. "My client, Mr. Mark Sloan, has filed a complaint asserting that your recent construction of a wooden privacy barrier, specifically the 8-foot cedar fence, has violated a long-standing municipal provision governing historical view corridors and cultural preservation zones within the district." Anna didn't respond immediately. She just looked at him, her eyes narrowing, her hand tightening on the edge of her robe. She hadn't been warned about this, hadn't even been given the courtesy of a conversation before it escalated to this level. "You're telling me my fence, which I built on my land with permits, is now a legal violation?" she asked finally, forcing her voice to remain even. The man didn't flinch. "You'll find all the information in the packet. We advise you to seek legal counsel immediately. You'll have 15 business days to respond to the filing before a preliminary injunction is considered." And just like that, he turned, walking briskly down the sidewalk and disappearing into a dark sedan parked 2 houses down. Anna didn't move for a long moment. Her fingers ran over the seal of the envelope as if trying to read its contents through the paper. A thin tremble moved through her chest. Not quite fear, not quite anger, but something dense, something cold, settling there like fog. She stepped back into the house and shut the door slowly behind her. When she opened the envelope at her kitchen table, she found a thick packet of documents, most of them filled with dense legal language that blurred together like static. But some things stood out immediately. Mark Sloan was accusing her of obstructing a protected architectural landscape. He claimed the wall, yes, that crumbling brick warehouse wall, was a rare surviving example of post-industrial symmetry from the late 1940s, and that her fence disrupted the visual continuity that he and others had appreciated for decades. It sounded insane. The wall had broken vents, mold, and graffiti from what looked like 3 separate decades. There were beer bottles in the gutters along its foundation, and every winter the wind blasted dust through its cracked mortar into her yard. But in the court documents it was framed like she had defaced a museum. She stared at the printed complaint, heart pounding. It didn't just accuse her of aesthetic damage. It mentioned a possible reassessment of property lines, and even cited a local bylaw that allowed for emergency injunctions in cases where visual history is at risk. That last phrase made her mouth go dry. She hadn't come here looking for conflict. She wanted peace, routine, safety. This house was supposed to be a place where her life could feel whole again, where she could plant things and watch them grow, not stand trial for obstructing someone's fantasy of a wall. That night, Anna sat in her living room surrounded by legal printouts and her building permits. The quiet of the house felt sharper than usual. Every creak of the floorboards, every tick of the old kitchen clock made the space feel more hollow. She kept the lights low, unsure whether the shadows outside her window belonged to trees or someone watching. She didn't want to become paranoid, but something about the way Sloan had gone about this, through back channels with no conversation, no warning, put her on edge. The next morning, she did the only thing she could do that made sense. She called a lawyer. Not the cheapest in town, but not flashy either. Someone local, someone who understood the quirks of the area. His name was Carl Dandridge, a gruff man in his late 50s with the kind of voice that had probably once belonged to a preacher or a cop. He listened without interrupting as she explained everything, starting from the construction of the fence, the letter from Sloane, and now this packet of legal absurdity. "Right out the gate with a suit," Carl said, more to himself than to her. "That's not neighborly. That's tactical." He rubbed his jaw and pulled out a legal pad. "You didn't violate any code. I'll verify that. But this guy, he's not going for a conversation. He wants precedent. And if he's citing municipal preservation laws, then he's already got someone in city planning whispering in his ear." Anna felt a deep pit settle in her stomach. "So what does that mean?" she asked. Carl didn't sugarcoat it. "It means this ain't about your fence. This is either about the land behind you, or it's about something else Sloane wants. Either way, you're the easiest obstacle to move." He tapped the packet she brought in. "I'll file a response. We'll request a stay, and in the meantime, we'll dig." The word dig didn't sit well with Anna. It made it sound like this was about to become some kind of war. But she trusted Carl's judgment. She left his office with a small knot of nausea, but also with the tiniest thread of reassurance. She wasn't alone in this. She wasn't going to roll over and let some bitter old man erase her space just because he wanted to play preservationist on a property line he didn't even own. By the time she got home, the sky had clouded over. As she stepped onto her porch, Anna noticed something strange. A small scrap of paper was sticking out from the top of her trash bin. It was a photograph, black and white, faded at the edges. She pulled it out. It showed the brick wall behind her house, but from decades ago. No graffiti, no cracks. A smooth, untouched face of brick and mortar, gleaming in afternoon light. Scribbled across the bottom in red pen were the words, "This is what you took." She stared at it for a long time, standing in the wind, her fingers slowly curling around the image. It wasn't just a fence anymore. It was personal, and whoever left that photograph wanted her to know it. 3 days after Anna's attorney filed the preliminary response to the lawsuit, she woke to the sound of her security lights blinking on and off in the backyard, triggered by something, or someone, moving just beyond the reach of the camera's infrared lens. It was just after 2 a.m. when she stepped barefoot onto the back porch, holding a flashlight in one hand and her phone in the other. The air was cool and damp, thick with the scent of turned soil and cut wood. The fence stood undisturbed in the dim orange wash of the floodlights, tall and still, casting elongated shadows that ran across the uneven grass. She scanned the yard and saw nothing unusual. No open gate, no broken panels, no visible footprints in the mulch. But the lights didn't lie. Someone had been here. By morning, Anna found the first real sign of escalation. Near the far end of the fence line, at the corner closest to the old warehouse wall, a deep gouge had been carved into the wood, long, jagged, and deliberate. Not a random scratch from wind-blown debris or an accidental strike from lawn equipment, but the kind of cut made with a heavy utility blade, dragged down in a slow, intentional stroke. She ran her fingers over the exposed wood. It was still fresh. Whoever did it had come in the night, under cover of darkness, and left without a trace. No note this time, no photograph, just damage. It wasn't enough to report as a crime on its own, not without proof. But it was a message. That much was clear. She called Carl, and he answered on the first ring. She explained what happened, and he didn't ask rhetorical questions. "They're trying to rattle you," he said. "We'll document everything. Every incident. You see a scratch on the paint? You take a photo. You see someone on the sidewalk looking too long? You note the time. This isn't about proof. It's about establishing a pattern. You don't need to prove intent right now. You need to show that you're being harassed." That word, harassed, felt too clinical for what she felt. This wasn't someone shouting threats or sending hate mail. It was worse. Quiet, strategic, impersonal. Carl sent a property inspector 2 days later to review the fence installation and photograph the damage. He confirmed everything was built according to code, with no violation of height or positioning. While he was there, Anna made him walk the perimeter twice. She pointed out every weak spot in the soil, every area where the grass had been trampled. She wanted someone else to see it, someone who could say, yes, something happened here, even if they couldn't say who did it. That same evening, Anna noticed a black car parked across the street from her house, not directly in front, just offset enough to avoid suspicion. It was there for hours. When she stepped out onto her porch, the lights dimmed. The engine stayed on. No one got out. No one rolled down a window. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't even intrusive. But it didn't belong, and she knew it. At dusk, the car rolled off, slow and silent. She didn't get the license plate. She hadn't thought to. But when she checked the footage from her security cameras, she found the angle didn't cover the front of the house, only the backyard. It was a blind spot. She added it to the log Carl had given her. Black sedan, no markings, idled for 2 hours. No visible occupants. The act of writing it down didn't make her feel safer, but it made her feel prepared. She was no longer reacting emotionally. She was building a case. Then came the letter from zoning. It arrived by registered mail, delivered by a man in a postal jacket who barely looked at her before walking away. Inside the envelope was a formal notice of investigation into unauthorized obstruction adjacent to a historic landmark. Anna stared at the page, her hands trembling. The complaint referenced the same wall Sloane had fixated on, but now it came stamped with the city's seal. It didn't accuse her directly, but it implied that her fence might fall under visual obstruction in a zone currently being reviewed for historic preservation. She called Carl again, and his voice sounded different this time. Tense. Controlled. "They're playing dirty," he said. "Someone pushed this through fast. That kind of review takes months, not days. They've got someone inside pushing for fast-track designation. It's not binding yet, but it's pressure. They want you to panic." Anna didn't panic, but she didn't sleep either. The next night she woke up to the sound of her dog barking. Not a startled yap, but a sustained guttural growl. By the time she made it to the back door, the dog was pressed against the fence, teeth bared, tail stiff, staring into the gap between the wall and the last post. Anna shone her flashlight through the boards and saw nothing. But the dog wouldn't move. She had to coax him inside with food and a leash. The next morning, she found a broken beer bottle jammed under the gate. Green glass wedged tightly into the latch like someone had tried to sabotage it from the outside. Again, no fingerprints. No prints at all. Just another piece of the puzzle. Carl advised her to file a police report, even if she didn't expect them to do much. "You're not asking them to investigate," he explained. "You're building a paper trail. Every report you file is another layer of protection. If this ends up in court, it matters." The officer who came out to take the report was polite but disengaged. Young. Too young to understand what this was. He asked if Anna had enemies, if she'd recently argued with a neighbor. When she mentioned the lawsuit, his eyes flicked up for a moment, but he didn't press. He gave her a card, told her to call if anything else happened, and left. It wasn't reassuring, but it wasn't a waste either. She took a photo of the report number and added it to the log. Then came the story in the local paper. Anna didn't subscribe to the paper, but her neighbor did, and she brought it over with wide eyes and a tight mouth. "Page 7, she said. "Bottom corner." Anna unfolded it, her hands already tensing before she saw the headline, "Preservation Petition Targets Mid-Century Wall." The article was small, barely 2 paragraphs, but it referenced the warehouse wall by name, calling it a structural remnant of regional importance and noting that recent private constructions may threaten the continuity of this cultural feature. No names. No addresses. But everyone would know. Anna sat on the porch for hours that evening, staring at the fence, her mind racing through everything she had done and everything they were trying to take away. She hadn't provoked anyone. She hadn't broken a single rule. She had followed every step, filed every permit, hired every inspector. But it wasn't enough. Not when someone like Sloane decided you were in the way. Not when someone decided they could turn your fence into a battlefield. The last thing she did that night was buy a second set of motion sensors, ones that would cover the blind spots. And she ordered a second camera, one that faced the street. Whatever came next, she would be ready. Not just to defend herself, but to prove, beyond doubt, that she was being hunted in plain sight. The morning that Anna received the city's official letter of intent to review her fence under potential cultural obstruction regulations, she didn't react the way she thought she would. There was no jolt of panic, no angry outburst, no hands shaking at the breakfast table. Instead, there was only a steady, quiet heaviness, the kind that settled into her chest and made her movements feel mechanical. She stood in the middle of the kitchen with the envelope still unopened in her hand, staring out the window at the sunlight leaking through the top of her cedar fence. Even from here, that wall, the one Mark Sloane fought so hard to preserve, was completely invisible. It hadn't been touched. It hadn't changed. Nothing had changed except the paperwork. That's what made her so tired. The knowledge that this fight had nothing to do with walls or fences or historic value. It had to do with control, and who got to draw the line between their space and someone else's. Carl showed up that afternoon with a folder already in hand. He didn't knock, just let himself through the gate and called her name from the garden. She met him on the back patio, and he laid the folder out on the table with a sigh that said everything she needed to know. "They're trying to push for emergency designation," he said. "I've seen this happen before in larger cities. Never here. It's rare, it's clumsy, and it reeks of strategy. They're trying to force a legal pivot before we can get a real hearing." He pulled out copies of the article from the paper and 2 internal memos obtained through a contact he had in city administration. One of the memos was dated just 2 weeks prior to her fence going up, long before Sloane filed his lawsuit, and mentioned exploratory talks about redefining the visual borders of heritage zones. Anna's hands curled around her coffee mug. "So this was planned," she said. Carl nodded slowly. "Yeah, this wasn't some spontaneous outrage over your fence. Sloane didn't decide to do this overnight. Someone's been working this angle for months. He's just the voice they're using to push it through." Anna looked down at the memo again and saw a name she didn't recognize. David L. Granger, listed as a project consultant for something called the Jefferson Corridor Reclamation Study. "Who the hell is that?" she asked. Carl leaned back in his chair. "That's what I'm about to find out." That evening, Anna walked the block for the first time in weeks, circling the rear alley where her fence met the warehouse wall, past the old rusted access door that no one had used in years. As she approached the far edge of the property, she saw a man crouched near the corner, middle-aged, dressed in work clothes, pretending to examine the pavement with a clipboard in hand. She slowed her steps. He didn't look like a neighbor. She'd never seen him before. His truck was unmarked. The moment he noticed her watching, he stood up and started walking back toward it. She kept her pace even, letting him get in and drive off before circling the area where he'd been crouched. There, in the dirt, was a small orange survey flag planted just inches from the fence post. It hadn't been there yesterday. It hadn't been approved by her, and no one had knocked to request access. She didn't touch the flag. She just took a picture of it and sent it to Carl, who called her within minutes. "They're testing ground claims," he said, "looking to create doubt about your property lines, even though we already have the certified survey on file. If they can introduce uncertainty, they can slow everything down and force mediation on their terms." Anna closed her eyes for a moment. "So what now?" she asked. Carl's voice was quiet. "Now, we go wider. We look into the real stakeholders, The next day, he brought her a folder labeled Granger Holdings. Inside were printouts from corporate databases, campaign donation records, and notes from past land acquisitions in other counties. Granger wasn't just a consultant. He was a real estate speculator who had a long history of working in the gray zone between city planning and private development. The Jefferson Corridor Reclamation Project, which had sounded like some vague bureaucratic plan, was actually a front for a string of targeted property conversions, taking aging industrial spaces and flipping them into boutique commercial lots under the guise of historical preservation and revitalization. Carl pointed to one line in a grant application Granger had submitted last year. Key visibility corridors will be preserved to maintain aesthetic integration with surrounding heritage. Structures, that was the phrase. That was the weapon they were now using against Anna's fence. So, if they preserve the wall, Anna said, they can zone everything around it as part of the corridor. Carl nodded. Exactly. And if your fence is declared an obstruction, they can not only demand you take it down, they can petition to redraw your lot line under eminent domain adjustments. They won't win that, but they don't have to. They just have to make the process too expensive for you to fight. Anna sat still for a long moment. So, what are they trying to build? Carl didn't answer right away. He just tapped the corner of the file and said, "That's what I'm still digging into." 2 days later, the digging paid off. Carl's contact in zoning confirmed an off-the-record conversation about converting the old warehouse into a mixed-use micro-retail strip. The plan wasn't public yet, but the investors were pushing for fast-track permits once the fence matter was resolved. Anna stared at the printout Carl handed her, an internal memo with only 3 lines highlighted in yellow. Visibility corridor. Must be preserved for architectural integration. It all clicked. Sloan wasn't sentimental. He wasn't nostalgic. He was involved. Whether directly or through compensation, he was enabling the people who wanted her land destabilized. But the true midpoint of the battle didn't come from the paperwork. It came the following week when Anna received a notice that someone had filed a request with the city clerk's office to access her property records, construction permits, and any zoning variances issued in her name. The request wasn't from Sloan. It was from a law firm in another state, Nevada. When Carl traced the firm's ownership, he found it was linked to a shell corporation that had purchased multiple properties in blighted neighborhoods across the region in the past year. Anna felt it like a punch to the chest. She wasn't being targeted by a neighbor with an opinion. She was being targeted by a system, a network of influence that used people like Sloan as pawns to create legal openings. Her fence wasn't just blocking a view, it was blocking money, and they didn't want to break her fence. They wanted to break her resolve. That night, she sat in the middle of her backyard, wrapped in an old blanket, her back against the very fence they were trying to erase. She didn't cry, she didn't panic. She just breathed. Slow, intentional. She looked up at the sky through the swaying tips of the cedar boards and reminded herself of why she had built the fence in the first place. Not to shut anyone out, but to reclaim something for herself. The moment she stood up, she made a decision. She wasn't going to chase them in circles. She was going to anchor herself in the process, in law, in reality. They could try to manipulate history, but she would respond with facts. Every claim would be countered, every move documented, every threat logged. She wasn't going to escalate emotionally. She was going to dismantle them procedurally, and if they wanted a war over a wall, then they'd better be ready to lose it by the book. The first real blow landed one morning when Anna opened her front door and found a citation taped to her porch railing, weather-warped at the corners from early dew, official seal stamped in blue ink, and language sharp enough to sting. Notice of code. Violation. It cited her for the presence of unauthorized physical alteration within proximity of historically sensitive infrastructure, and imposed a conditional fine, $750, to be reevaluated weekly until compliance was achieved. It wasn't from zoning this time. It came from the Public Infrastructure Preservation Board, a department she hadn't even heard of until now. She didn't have to ask Carl what it meant. They were stacking pressure from multiple sides now, creating overlapping threats that individually seemed minor but collectively started to look like a landslide. What disturbed Anna more than the citation itself was the fact that someone had been close enough to her home to tape it directly to the wood, rather than dropping it in the mailbox like all the other city notices. Someone had walked up to her door, stood just inches from her front window, and marked her like a target. She scanned her security footage, but the camera covering the porch had glitched out the night before, static filled, then black for nearly 90 minutes. She stared at the corrupted file, jaw tight. It wasn't broken. It had been disabled. She called Carl, but she already knew what he'd say before he answered. "They're applying pressure, hoping you fold before the hearing," he said. "And they're doing it smart, keeping each threat small, each action technically legal. Nothing you can fight alone, but together it creates a siege." His voice was gruffer than usual. "I've filed motions to freeze the fines, but that won't stop them from issuing new ones. And Anna, you should know something." There was a pause, too long, too heavy. "I got a call, a reporter. Someone tipped them off. Your name's going to be in the story. They're going to frame it like a dispute between a stubborn homeowner and historic conservationists." She didn't say anything for a moment, just stood in her living room, surrounded by copies of permits, reports, photos, letters, an entire wall now covered in carefully taped documentation. "Let them print it," she finally said. "I don't care what the public thinks. I care what the court sees." But it wasn't the court she had to worry about that night. At 3:26 a.m., the alarm in her backyard tripped. The alert came through her phone. Motion detected. Back gate. She threw on a robe, grabbed the heavy flashlight she now kept by the door, and stepped into the night. Her breath caught halfway between lungs and throat. The cedar fence had been slashed, not just a mark this time, but a deep, ugly gash across one of the central panels. Splinters scattered across the ground, and at the base of the cut someone had jammed a piece of metal into the earth. An old iron hook, rusted and shaped like a twisted shepherd's crook. It wasn't a tool, it was a symbol. She didn't touch it. She just backed away slowly, went inside, and called the sheriff's department. This time, she didn't ask politely. She demanded a report be filed. An officer arrived 40 minutes later, older than the last one, more attentive. He photographed the damage, took the hook as evidence, and said he'd canvass the block. But Anna could tell by the way he spoke that he didn't expect to find anything. The person who had done this hadn't acted randomly. They knew the angles, the cameras, the timing. They knew how far to go without triggering an automatic arrest. But they'd crossed a line now. This was vandalism. This was criminal. It changed the scope of the situation, and, to Carl's credit, it changed the way the city viewed it, too. Within days, the citation was paused. Not canceled, just pending investigation. But it was a crack in the wall. Anna thought the worst had passed. But then the sabotage started. It began with her water line. One morning, she turned the kitchen tap, and nothing came out but a groaning hiss. The city utilities department said it was routine maintenance. A neighbor told her no other house had lost water. 2 days later, her trash bins vanished from the curb. Not rolled away, gone. When she called to replace them, the city said they'd been decommissioned due to non-compliance with residential bin protocol. That same week, a contractor she'd hired to repaint her eaves canceled abruptly, saying he'd been warned that ongoing litigation might complicate the project. She asked who had warned him. He didn't answer. Carl's tone turned colder with every new report. "They're isolating you," he said, "undermining your ability to maintain the property. It's a play to make your home appear neglected. If they can get enough eyes on it, they can initiate a community standards violation and layer it on top of everything else. Anna clenched her jaw, fingers stiff around the phone. "And if I fix everything myself?" she asked. "What then?" Carl hesitated. "Then they'll just try harder. You're not dealing with a neighbor anymore. You're dealing with a campaign." Then came the dog. Anna returned from the hardware store one afternoon to find her shepherd, Grady, vomiting in the side yard, his legs trembling, foam collecting around the edges of his mouth. The vet diagnosed chemical poisoning, most likely ingestion of antifreeze or pesticide. Grady survived, but the damage to his kidneys was permanent. There was no way to prove it was deliberate, but Anna knew. She saw the pattern now, the slow build, the tightening net of pressure designed not to break the fence but to break her resolve. She stayed calm. That night she installed 2 new cameras, not security models from a chain store, professional-grade equipment with multiple backups and encrypted streaming. She rerouted the data feed through a private server Carl had recommended and paid a technician to map blind spots and lock down wireless access. No more glitches, no more gaps, no more vulnerability. Still, she slept less. She dreamed of footsteps in the yard, of laughter behind the wall, of her name whispered through old vents. And then, one morning, she found the photographs. Folded neatly in an unmarked envelope on her porch were 5 glossy prints, each taken from behind her home, aimed through the slats in the fence. They showed her standing in the garden, crouching near the rose bushes, reading on the back porch. They were dated, time-stamped, precise. She was never aware of the lens, never once saw a flash or heard a click. Someone had been watching, not just trespassing, surveilling. For weeks, maybe longer. She didn't call Carl. She drove straight to his office, the photos still in her hand. He opened the door before she knocked and took one look at her face before motioning her inside. She laid the prints out on his desk, one by one. "This is a new line," he said grimly, "and it might be the one they regret crossing." He called in a contact from a private investigative firm. A woman named Shell, who spoke little, moved efficiently, and wore a badge clipped to her collar that meant she didn't need small talk to get to work. Within an hour, Shell had swept the property, identified 2 possible vantage points behind the warehouse wall, and found evidence of a collapsible ladder being moved through the alley in recent days. She promised to keep watch discreetly. Anna didn't ask for details. She didn't want to know how Shell did her job. She just needed the results. By the end of that week, a motion was filed on her behalf citing escalating harassment, unauthorized surveillance, property sabotage, and intentional psychological duress. Carl included the photos, the citations, the utility sabotage, and even the poisoned dog, all meticulously documented. It wasn't a counterattack. It was a statement. "I see you. I see what you're doing, and I will not back down." The war had changed. This wasn't about fences anymore. It was about ownership, not just of property, but of narrative, of truth. And Anna had decided that she would be the last one standing in her own yard, no matter how long the siege lasted. The hearing was scheduled for a Monday morning at 8:30 a.m., in a cramped courtroom on the 2nd floor of the municipal building that still smelled of old carpet cleaner and copier ink. Anna arrived early, dressed in quiet gray and navy, her hair tied back, her shoulders squared. She didn't want to look combative, just resolved. Carl was already waiting inside, sleeves rolled up, a briefcase full of neatly ordered documentation sitting open beside him. Across the room, Mark Sloan sat behind his attorney, arms crossed, wearing a sport coat with corduroy elbows and that same mask-like scowl he'd worn the first day he appeared in her life. But this time, he didn't look smug. He looked tight, rehearsed, controlled. The city's legal representative, a young woman in a beige blazer and hard plastic glasses, opened by reading a prepared statement about the potential impact of unregulated residential modifications on visual heritage corridors. She made references to planning board evaluations, architectural intent, and the importance of preserving historically relevant backdrops for future cultural programming. She spoke for 6 minutes and didn't once mention the fence by name. When she finished, Sloane's attorney rose, clicked on a presentation remote, and began showing photos of the warehouse wall, cropped and edited to appear majestic, almost solemn, the bricks glistening in dramatic light. It was laughable if it hadn't been so calculated. Then came his real punch, a map from the Jefferson Corridor Reclamation Project, with Sloane's property and Anna's both boxed in red, labeled Phase E1 Visibility Impact Study. He argued that Anna's fence not only obstructed communal aesthetic experience, but posed a legal disruption to future urban integration. Carl didn't interrupt. He let them finish. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked calmly to the center of the room. He didn't start with photographs. He started with names. David L. Granger, corporate consultant, linked to land acquisitions in 3 nearby counties, involved in early-stage discussions for converting industrial spaces under the pretext of cultural preservation. Connected financially to a holding company now registered as partial owner of the lot behind Anna's fence. Carl submitted articles, grant proposals, and purchase orders, all publicly available, all signed. He showed that the reclamation project's designation had not been finalized, that the wall in question had never received historic status, and that the photos used by Sloane's team had been digitally enhanced. He submitted raw images, gritty, unedited, current, of the crumbling wall, graffiti, cracks, chipped mortar, evidence of rot. A structure in decay, not legacy. Then he dropped the hammer. He presented Anna's logbook, dates, times, incidents. He submitted police reports, veterinary records, photographs of vandalism, copies of citations, canceled contractor statements, and finally, the surveillance photographs found on her porch. Images that placed her under unconsented observation, with timestamps corresponding to private moments inside her yard. The court clerk grew noticeably tense as the pictures were passed forward. The judge, a woman in her early 60s with a lined face and sharp eyes, leaned forward and asked, "Do we have any confirmation of who took these?" Carl didn't blink. "We have evidence linking the vantage point to a ladder found behind the warehouse wall. My client was not notified of any authorized inspections. No permits for visual survey were filed. Whoever took those images was trespassing, or acting under direct orders from someone who was." The room shifted. Sloane leaned forward as if to speak, but his attorney gently placed a hand on his arm. It was the first unspoken signal of retreat. The judge asked for a short recess, reviewed the documents in chambers, and returned 20 minutes later with a voice that had turned from formal to steel. She began by noting that the wall in question was not, at the time of the complaint, under any official designation of historic preservation. She acknowledged the city's right to evaluate heritage structures, but stated unequivocally that the retroactive enforcement of unofficial plans had no standing in a dispute involving private, legally constructed property modifications. She acknowledged Anna's fence as compliant with code and legally permitted, but she didn't stop there. She addressed the evidence of targeted harassment, vandalism, surveillance, strategic citation, coordinated pressure through municipal departments. She called it deeply troubling, and said that while the court could not formally assign criminal blame, it would refer the matter for civil review and request an investigation into possible abuse of administrative influence. Then she turned her attention to Mark Sloane. In a voice that never rose above calm, the judge said, "You may consider this a matter of aesthetics, Mr. Sloane, but the court considers it a matter of intrusion." She denied his petition, struck the complaint from record, and awarded Anna partial legal fees for the cost of defense. Anna didn't smile. She didn't even breathe deeply until she was back outside, standing on the municipal steps as the cold morning sun rose behind the concrete buildings. Carl stood beside her, silent for a long moment, then said, "It's not over, but it's yours now." And for the first time in weeks, Anna allowed herself to believe it. The weeks that followed felt different. Not lighter, nothing about what had happened was light, but quieter, more settled, as if the air itself had been reset. The fence still stood exactly as she'd built it, straight, strong, deliberate. Every morning, Anna walked its length, fingertips grazing the cedar boards like she was checking for pulse, for breath, for any sign of intrusion. There was none. The late summer wind moved through the leaves, not through fear. Sloane never approached her again. His windows stayed closed, curtains drawn, his yard untouched. Carl later confirmed that the city quietly shelved the Jefferson Corridor proposal, temporarily, maybe permanently, after the hearing revealed the irregularities in how the project had been handled. No official announcement was made, but the emails stopped. The phone calls, the citations. It was as if they all simply vanished, leaving behind a silence Anna didn't fully trust, but accepted for what it was. The photographs remained in a locked drawer. She didn't throw them away. They were part of the story now. Proof not just of what had happened, but of how far someone had been willing to go to unmake her space, her privacy, her right to exist without oversight. Grady followed her more closely now, always a few paces behind, a silent shadow that never left her side. The vet said he'd recover, slowly, and Anna found comfort in the ritual of care, measuring food, administering medicine, tracking progress. Routine had become armor. One evening, a neighbor she barely knew knocked on her door and handed her a tin of baked bread, awkward and wordless. Anna didn't ask for explanation. They both understood it for what it was, an acknowledgement, not apology, not alliance, just recognition.